Okay, good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to this session on ensuring increased and better financing for education in emergencies. So on behalf of the Swiss government, of Education Cannot Wait, and of the Geneva Hub for Education for Emergencies, I welcome you to this hopefully very interactive session. My name is Frutiger with the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. As you know and as you have seen, the funding gap for education in emergencies is important. Education is often only 2 to 4% of humanitarian emergency appeals, and of that, if we can have the slide with the stat, and of that only 22% is actually really received funding. So you have on this table in blue education funding actually received, and in orange, you have the actual needs. So this difference is important. The Education Emergencies Hub last year produced and published a flagship report from different data sources, which for the first time establishes these challenges we have on funding for education in emergencies. So not only did the report establish the challenges, but it also proposed a set of concrete solutions and actions. And we want to look at these actions at 3 of those areas in the next 40 minutes or so. The 3 areas, before we go to our distinguished panelists, are 1, better reporting and tracking of education in emergencies funding. Second, the importance of private sector funding. We know there is a big gap with the public sector funding, so other funding sources, philanthropy and private sector have to be mobilized. And then third, which seems obvious, we need a joined-up approach in order to close this gap and get the support needed for action on education in emergencies. And we have, in order also to bring in the voice from the ground and the voice of the young people, those really most concerned with education, representative from the youth movement that has been very present in these 2 days here at the high-level pledging conference. So I'm now pleased to introduce our speakers. So we have Sarah Amu, the UK representative of Youth Education in Emergencies Global Youth Panel. So it's an initiative supported by ECW. Then we have Adrian Lovett, who is the CEO of Development Initiatives. We have Roger Rüegg, who is the head of Quant Multi-Asset Solutions at the Zürcher Kantonalbank on your left. And we have Robert Jenkins, a Global Director of Education and Adolescent Development at UNICEF. You can all participate in the conversation. You should see here now the QR code for Pigeonhole. Please scan the QR code, type in your questions, and we will take the questions either at the end or, as I presume, since we will be a bit short on time, during the discussion with the panelists. I will ask a few questions to the panelists, and we will see if we can introduce at the same time some of the questions you have on Pigeonhole. So please use this opportunity, pose your questions, and we will try to answer as good as possible. So without further ado, let's now start with our first panelist. So, Sarah, can you please tell us from your experience what are the consequences of lack of funding for education in emergencies? And you have to press the button. Yes.
Thank you, Christian, and welcome to everyone joining online and in person today. My name is Sarah, as earlier introduced. Growing up in Nigeria, I got to see the learning gaps and divide in the education system, which occurred as a result of a lack of funding, including a lack of care and lack of protection. This lack of care and lack of protection continue to result in countless number of attacks that makes the learning environment very unsafe and unfit for children and young people to remain in education. I remember in April 2014, I had sat to write my final exams, and not long after, we have just heard that over 270 schoolgirls who sat to write the same exams like me had been abducted by an Islamist military terrorist group in Nigeria known as the Boko Haram, who are against any kind of Western learning or education. At the point of hearing this news, I couldn't really figure out as a young person then what the impact of this news would be long term. But one thing I do remember was the fear, the anxiety, and the uncertainty that this news left in my heart and in my mind. I also thought about the mothers who had no hopes of ever seeing their daughters again. I thought about families, I thought about siblings, and I said to myself, that could have been me, it could have been anyone else. And from then on, the issue of insecurity that continues to plague the education system in Nigeria has not gotten better. We've had cases of over 300 school children in a government secondary school in Nigeria getting abducted in Zamfara State by this same terrorist group. We've also had cases of over 140 school students, girls, getting abducted by this same terrorist group in Kaduna State. And also a number of 110 students getting abducted in a government secondary school by this same terrorist group. And it is in situations like this, in contexts like this, that I would expect the government to be proactive enough to ensure that this issue of insecurity that continues to plague and divide the education system is resolved. Following a recent report by UNESCO in 2022, over 20 million children in Nigeria remain out of school. This is a country whose population is totaled at 216.7 million people. Following this report, the Nigerian government actually promised to increase enrollment from 46 to 90%. And we do appreciate them for that, but I'm here to say that that is not enough. Because if the issue of insecurity, if the issue of abduction, if the issue of kidnap is not resolved, then there is no solution for children to remain in education. Like someone rightly said yesterday, where there is no peace, there can't be education.
Thank you.
It is within context like this that I would like to say that financing education in emergencies must remain a priority. It is important because financing education in emergencies helps to increase the access for young people to access education. And to be honest, it is not really about just funding alone, but there is a lot of concern that goes into the structure of this education system. There is a lot of concern that goes into the learning providers who are there to provide psychosocial support for these children to remain in education. There is a huge concern that must go into the digital technology and the provision for the right equipment for these children to remain in learning. And in terms of my expectation for everyone seated here today, I would like to emphasize that funding education in emergencies must remain a priority because it is important for every child to remain in learning and have access to equal education. I would also say that the aspect of insecurity and the issues that continue to plague different countries in their different contexts must be resolved, because if it is not resolved and if the government and the policymakers decide to solve the issues or help children to return back to education without actually solving the main issues that, keeps education halted, then there would never be a long-term solution. I would also like to say that Children and young people who are mostly affected need to be fully involved in the policies and decision-making processes in their country. A government or policymaker cannot make a full impact or a full decision without actually involving and hearing the children and the young people who have mostly been affected by these issues. And lastly, accountability must be key in every country. Because even if the funding has been allocated, we expect that the government, the leaders, and the decision makers must be accountable to young people and make them understand that we are being heard and we are being supported. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Applause for Sarah. And thanks a lot, Sarah, thanks for your statement, thanks for these very clear messages, and thanks for taking action and a clear message to all of us who are participating here in this conference. We will come back to Sarah in the Q&A, and hopefully with questions you have here in the room and questions you have online. For those online, again, either the QR code, but you can also type your question directly on the right-hand side of your screen. So let's now turn to Adrian Lovett. Adrian, Development Initiatives, a global organization harnessing the power of data and, of course, trying to provide evidence for then tools and instruments to end poverty and increase resilience. Adrian, we've heard that one of the challenges of lack of funding is the lack of data. So what can you bring to the table, and how can actually tracking humanitarian funding or the lack thereof inform better decision making?
Well, I think that tracking data matters in two broad ways. And as I go into that, Christian, I do just want to kind of recognize what we just heard from Sarah and the reality of the lack of data, the lack of knowledge, the lack of insight that we as a world, as a global community, too often have into real impacts, real human impacts, like what you told us, Sarah, about, you reminded us of 2014 and the Chibok girls that were taken then, and the impact that that had on you as a young woman in Nigeria, and the fact that, as you said, it's not gone away, that insecurity. You know, I think for so much of the world with COVID and with Ukraine and with the earthquake and everything, you know, people move on, but these things are real. And that's why we need data, because data is about two things, as I say. Firstly, it's about knowing if the decisions that are being made based on the reality on the ground. Is sufficient funding allocated to people with the greatest need? And are different types of need being met, including, most obviously, as we're all focused here, on education and emergencies. A quick example, our work at Development Initiatives, some of what we've been doing, our team have been doing, was to do some tracking on flows in food crises, finance flows in food crises. And what we saw was 193 million people needed urgent help in 2021. But in the same year, funding to food sectors per person in need was down by 40%. So there was a direct contradiction between the need and the response to the need. That's a system that's not working. We know this because of data, and we need the same knowledge for the area of education in emergencies where data is really hard to come by. The second reason for the need for that data, I think, is around accountability. Yesterday, fantastically, we saw $826 million of commitments made on the stage next door. And that's terrific. That's a hugely important beginning. But it's data that will ensure transparency and accountability for those commitments. And again, a quick example, we've all worked in the context of the Grand Bargain, and 7 years ago, Grand Bargain members and donors made a commitment that 25% of humanitarian resources would go to local and national actors as directly as possible. But in our work at Development Initiatives, we focused, for example, on Turkey and the Turkish response to the Syrian refugee crisis, and this was, of course, before the shattering events of the last couple of weeks. But what we found there was that only about 1% of humanitarian resources were going directly to local and national NGOs. Only about 5% were going to them even indirectly, and about 13% to local and national government. So all of that well short of the commitment and that target that the international community made. And this is Turkey. This is a developed civil society. This is a crisis that is 10 years on. There should be no reason why those resources can't be directed as directly as possible to those who need them. And at a global level, just very quickly to finish, our global research shows that in 2021, only 1.2% of humanitarian assistance went to local and national actors directly. So that's the kind of accountability that data gives us, the ability to go to those who've made commitments, who have responsibility, and say, you've said this, you're doing that, there's the gap, let's fill it.
Very much. So if I'm paraphrasing, is that the global system is funding itself. Is that correct?
I think that's right.
So what, out of this research and out of these conclusions, what would be your recommendations for organizations, also like the Geneva Hub on Education in Emergencies? What would be your recommendations for measures they should take? And there's this idea about a financing observatory to track funding on education in emergencies.
Yeah. I mean, on that, Christian, I think our sense is that it's an important initiative. The idea of an observatory for education initiatives, education and in emergencies finance tracking. It's important, I think, firstly to make sure that doesn't duplicate, but instead builds on existing data ecosystems. One of the great dangers in data is that we count again things that have already been counted. That has a burden, most obviously on those at the front end, right down to the primary school head teacher, the community health worker, the district planner, the people who have to generate this data and too often don't ever see the benefits of that data to enable them to do their job. So important that the ideas around the observatory take into account data systems that are already there rather than perhaps rushing to create something new. And then to ask a few key framing questions. What data is actually necessary versus what's desirable? Who benefits from data? So does the potential dashboard meet the needs of different stakeholders, perhaps including those primary school head teachers and district planners, as well as finance ministers and people tracking the SDG framework and so on from subnational to a global level? And is that data interoperable? Got to think about how, even as we do create new streams of data, how they interact with existing humanitarian and development sector data. This could be an opportunity to help to bridge that nexus divide, the challenge that that we can see more in education, perhaps than anything else, of how different funding streams and different initiatives affect and contribute to our ability to ensure kids, especially in emergencies, get the education they need. That's a complex kind of funding environment, and the solutions need to recognize that complexity.
Thank you very much. Applause for Adrian. And thanks for the advice on the observatory. No duplication, certainly an important point. Now let's turn to Roger Rüegg. Roger, you're heading Quant Asset Solutions at the Zurich Kantonalbank here in Switzerland. That sounds like an awful lot of money.
Yes, we manage a lot of money, and that's the core business, and that's why we are here. Yeah.
So yes, talking about the core business. So why would the financial sector institution, why would the private sector be concerned and become involved in funding education in emergencies?
Yes, and also thank you for the panel, Adrian. Data is also very important then for our proposed solution. And I think the private sector, we strongly believe that education is the foundation upon we build our future, not only for the public sector, also for the private sector. So first of all, the private sector has to be engaged because of that. And second, we think that education has a big multiplier, if not the biggest multiplier at all. So we believe that it's the source for prosperity, for the independence of individuals and of countries, but it's also very important for a healthy and sustainable economy, and that's why the private sector has to be involved. And third, we think that we face a new paradigm, as we also saw from Sarah, like there is an increasing need of funding for education in emergencies. But on the other hand, there is a lot of pressure on the traditional help. So all the crises, the recent crisis like post-corona crisis, post-financial crisis, then the corona crisis, then the Ukraine crisis, this put a lot of burden on the debt of our governments, and they can no longer fund the education in emergencies in a sustainable way, and that's why the private sector has to step in and take action. And I think the comparative advantage of the private sector is that it's still very healthy and that we have the instruments at hand. And we just have to transform these instruments for this new purpose. And this new purpose is getting funding for education cannot wait, and to help like these 222 million children that are affected.
Thank you very much. And please, people here in the room and you all online, continue to ask questions. I will ask one which you have not yet asked. You can put it on the pigeonhole. If we can put back maybe the QR code. Put your questions into the pigeonhole. Then you have higher likelihood that it actually gets asked, and you can vote for your preferred questions. So if we're short of time, we'll ask the ones with the most votes. If we have more time, we'll also take questions from the room. But Roger, this sounds great, but you're a business. So I would like to ask you, well, two things. One, what is in it for the private sector? We know private sector invests in things which generate some sort of return for their business. And then second, what is the specific solution your bank has been working on in order to support education cannot wait in financing from the private sector?
Yes, thank you, Christian. So as we said in the beginning, it's our core business to get money from people that have money to people or projects that need money. And it's in our DNA that we do sustainable financing. So we created our first mutual fund at Zürcher Kantonalbank in 1998. So we have like a proven track record of 25 years. And that's exactly what we propose. We want to create a mutual fund with existing donators. And if we also find here existing donators that then want to invest in our fund, please reach out to me after this presentation here, or also to Anja Hochberg. We really are looking for people that start with us this mutual fund, and we already committed to be part of it, but we need more investors. And if we maybe go back to the first slide, we by that try to multiply our donation base. So we want to broaden our donation base and attract other retail investors, the private market, that also invest into this fund. And this fund will have a double impact. It will, first of all, invest in a very sustainable way. So we have a very strict, sustainable approach that invests into companies that actually support these 17 SDGs, and that it's in line with the Paris Agreement of this 1.5 climate degree goal. And on top of that, and most importantly, we will donate this 3% investment return that we expect from the fund to Education Cannot Wait. So we have like a double impact. When we go to the next slide, we see here that we really want to multiply the investment. So we calculated that if we start with 50 million in the beginning with existing donators and attract 25 million each year, over 10 years, we could generate 50 million donations to Education Cannot Wait. We would invest 140 millions into SDG companies, into companies that support the SDGs. And on top of that, it's a win-win situation for the investor, because the investor would still have his capital preserved, and our goal is to still get a bit of return for the investor that takes part into this mutual fund. So it should be a win-win situation for everyone, for Education Cannot Wait and the investor itself. And if we sum up the solution, it's on the last slide, that we really want to broaden the investor base. So we want to attract the private sector to take action. We want this double impact. We want to invest it in a sustainable way and get additional donations to Education Cannot Wait. And that's why we are here, because we know how to implement that. We want to do this in a very efficient way with an attractive pricing and guarantee seamless donation for Education Cannot Wait. And that's also why Adrian is so important. We also want to report that to our investors with impact reporting and KPIs. And that's basically the solution that we propose.
Happy to help with that, by the way.
Thank you very much. A quick follow-up question. What happens if you actually don't make a return in a year on this particular investment fund?
Yes, it should be a long-term investment, and we will pay out it in any way. So, of course, if it goes down to zero, we couldn't pay out anything, but it won't happen. And we have a very long track record, and capital markets are here to work with the capital. And even though if we don't make returns, we will donate 3% per year, as we calculate it, each year to Education Cannot Wait.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Roger. And you mentioned that you've been stepping in for Anja Hochberg, who unfortunately is suffering. So thanks for jumping in so quickly. If you switch off your microphone, then we can move over to Robert Jenkins. Robert, Global Director of Education and Adolescent Development at UNICEF. So no need to present UNICEF, but why is enhanced cooperation between the humanitarian and development actors, the so-called nexus approach, important to improve the funding for education in emergencies? And what are the lessons learned from different contexts where this is happening?
Well, thanks very much for that question, and thanks to the panelists. Thanks for this opportunity, and I really appreciate the earlier comments and insights, and look forward to the questions. I think at least I'm going to start with sharing some frustration around this topic, because it's long-standing and we continue to have it. The importance of working in the nexus, or the importance of balancing between humanitarian development, but we're not still progressing, I think, the way we would like to. There's some great examples. I'm sure all of us in the room have some their own personal experiences in working in the nexus, or basically leveraging humanitarian support to making development gains. We have examples in UNICEF of supporting, say, in a humanitarian response, teacher trainings or materials, provision of materials, or rehabilitating schools, etc., that have a lasting impact. These are good examples. And we have some really exciting examples of the disruption that crisis causes, if you want to look at it as an opportunity that can create new, even social dynamics, like inclusion in schools of kids that were not in school before. We have examples of that during when schools were closed at a time of COVID. Kids were learning for the first time in some countries. So these are great examples. But the bottom line is we still have a long ways to go. And why that is I think there are some challenges. One is the short-term nature of humanitarian funding. It's often very sort of 3 months, 6 months, very time-bound. So it's hard to make big systemic changes with such short-term money. I think there is obviously a political and sort of the news cycles of humanitarian response. A lot of money comes to certain crises, and then other long-term challenges get forgotten. We see that happening right now, like in many countries, the forgotten emergency challenge, and that then makes us in a very short-term responsive cycle to those crises that right now are on top of mind. Mm-hmm. So that's a challenge. I also think we ourselves in the industry, if you like, of education and humanitarian development assistance, we don't help ourselves by having different areas that are our focus. Some of us see ourselves as humanitarian, some of us see ourselves as development, and we often don't collaborate as effectively as we can.
It's a long discussion. I remember when I worked for the ICRC, that's almost 30 years ago. Yeah. Which says something about my age, but we at the time talked about the continuum versus the contiguum. So this discussion is still going on. At the Swiss Development Agency, we actually just put recently the humanitarian and the development cooperation teams together, also in terms of funding decisions. What do you think about such an approach?
So I think that's definitely the way. We'd like to hear from others too, but from my point of view, I think that's definitely a way forward, is for us to. Well, there's some common themes that cut across in education that cut across both humanitarian, the nexus, and development. Say, for example, learning outcomes. Everyone in my own country, in Canada, but all around the world, everyone's struggling with why are kids attending school and not learning the way we. Well, in times of humanitarian crisis, that's exacerbated, particularly marginalized children. But in development context, so I think if we can take these common themes, the importance of inclusion in all contexts, the importance of measurement, of results. I think these are themes that can cut across humanitarian development, get us into the nexus, and ideally, then, as per the title of this session, increase and improve our financing.
Exactly. So now looking at the funding side of this, do you think there is an advantage, or what would be the challenges and opportunities of a nexus approach to education in emergencies funding?
So I think that, so what did we learn? One of the key lessons we learned from when schools were closed in times of COVID were those countries that were more prepared, more resilient, more dynamic, different ways that kids could learn, perform better. And the good news is it didn't correlate with income. There were some high-income countries that underperformed and low-income countries that way overperformed in terms of where you would expect as per their development status. So I think by focusing on preparedness, resilience, systemic planning and processes, and all collaborating around a common structure and plans around these themes I mentioned, I think we can move a long way. What is not helpful are to categorize, this is a humanitarian context, this is a development context, even this is the term nexus. I think these are ideas that have boxed us into these kind of fixed ways of working, and it's not helpful.
Okay, thanks a lot. Applause for Robert. And thanks for the message on breaking down the silos. So we have received quite a number of questions. The two which received most votes, I will just take them now. The first one is, what can be done to improve financing mechanisms to ensure that funding is made accessible to youth-led and girl-led organizations who are at the forefront of action on the ground? Who would like to take this question?
Adrian, I'm happy to in a sentence or two.
Your mic is on. You can. Why don't you continue?
Sorry, and I'll turn it off. I promise. So I think there is a positive trend in terms of allocation of global funding to youth-led and girl-led other marginalized groups-led organizations. And over the last 2 days, also as part of the Transforming Summit last September, the Transforming Education Summit, it was repeatedly confirmed by governments, by organizations of the importance of that. So that's the good news. I think in order for us to make a big step in this regard, I do think we need to document best practices. We need to leverage existing capacities of these organizations that can coach other organizations and almost like a snowball effect in various countries. But the bottom line is, I think this is the way of the future, is to enable youth-led, marginalized, group-led organizations at local level take more of a leadership role.
Thank you. Roger, and then Adrian. And Sarah, if you want to come in, of course, you're, I think, on this mature panel, the best qualified to respond to such questions. Well, you're a bit younger, Roger, so go ahead.
Absolutely, I guess, yeah. As we said, like, we have to involve the private sector, and we have to increase the engagement and collaboration of the private sector. And such a solution as we propose is a new way. It's basically using the existing instruments in the private sector and adapting it to this new purpose. And that's a way to ensure like a stable funding of education in emergencies.
Thank you. Adrian?
Just really quickly, two things. What I was saying earlier about ensuring funds get to locally led and nationally led organizations, NGOs and others, pushing forward with that will benefit youth-led organizations, women-led organizations. We know that from the research about where organizations are and they would seek to benefit. And related to that, there is also a push, as many people here will know, to look again at how the international community looks at what we, perhaps inappropriately call overheads, right? The funds that are desperately needed by organizations, especially smaller organizations that are community-led, to build the capabilities to not just do the job right in front of them, but to do the next one and the one after. And funding does not, historically, has taken far too little account of that need, and that's a shift that would be very positive, I think, for the kind of organizations that the question is talking about. Thank you.
Sarah, do you want to come in? Thank you. Another question is the one related to the teachers. Of course, the teachers are now beyond the community-led organizations that are obviously critical, but teachers, for teachers to be able to continue to operate even in times of crisis, it is critical that salaries are paid. And it's one of these big challenges which then lead to interruption of education in emergency. So what can be done that teacher salaries are actually paid in a timely manner in times of emergency or crisis?
Do you want to keep going? Please.
Yes, Sarah.
Yeah, so in terms of how teachers can properly be paid and, prioritize in this issue of education in emergencies, I think it comes with a mindset of people understanding that education is very important. Where I grew up in Nigeria, education is not regarded on the same level as, doctors or engineers would be regarded. Teachers are regarded a lot more on a lower level than, we see the doctors, the engineers, the scientists, which shouldn't be the case, because I believe that educators, teachers are also as important as the doctors, as the lawyers that we see all over the world. And if we come from that mindset, knowing that these teachers actually do a lot, they are involved in the psychosocial support of children in times of crisis. They are involved in putting a lot more, even more than the actual 9 to 5, because many of these teachers go back home. They have their kids, they have their families to tend for, but they are still also thinking about the children they are going to see in school the next day. So they actually do a lot. And if, the government policymakers can actually understand that, teachers actually are prioritizing this sector, and also we should give them as much support as they need, I think it would be very useful in education in emergencies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And a last question from Pigeonhole, and then maybe we can go for a quick one from here in the room, if there is a pressing question. The question from the Pigeonhole survey is, what is actually more effective, investing in education in emergencies or investing into the resilience and inclusion of existing current country education systems? A very brief response, whoever wants to take this question. That's maybe one for you, Rob.
So the easy answer is we need both, but that's, I think we're still as a development humanitarian community, we're still overly weighted to investing in the response. And that comes back to it's politically, it's on people's front page of news and people then donate and it's short term in nature. But then, of course, we end up in these traps of just constantly responding to crisis after crisis and are underinvesting in the resilience and sort of systemic change that's required. So I think collectively we need to continue to make the argument, all of us in the sector, to ministers of finance, to ministers of development, to heads of state in all countries, developed and developing alike, that indeed investing in resilience and systemic change to enable countries to better adapt. And that the most worrying thing, of course, is I think we're all seeing an increased frequency of crises and disasters, including related to climate change and others. So I think ever more important for us to invest in these sort of resilient, dynamic systems that enable countries to adapt quicker.
Thanks, Rob. I'll take one question, two, from the room. And then we'll step a few minutes into the coffee break. We started 5 minutes late, so we'll finish 5 minutes late, if that is okay. So I take two questions from the room, and then we'll come back to the panelists. Question number one. Yes, you had your hand up already very early, and then we take the question here. Yes, please. Very briefly, a question, not a statement.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much. My name is Yusuf Al-Badr. I'm the Deputy Director of Operations for Southeast Asia and Pacific in Kuwait Fund. My question is as follows. I've listened quite clearly. What we're trying to do is identify a sustainable modality to be able to deliver and with sustainability. I posted a question. This is my personal take. I've been in this field for 25 years. My personal belief is, and that's my personal take, I think with all these resources that have been mobilized yesterday, they should be channeled, and Education Can Wait should seriously consider setting up a fund, a revolving fund. You've got you've got IFAD, you've got an agriculture fund, you've got funds for all these institutions. I believe it's the right time to channel all resources under the UN umbrella to focus on education.
In a revolving fund, type
in
IFAD.
a revolving fund, which means donors, when they put the money is reinvested internally or in respected countries. That will cover the administrative cost of the institution, so the actual donations will go purely to the people themselves. I mean, that's my personal take.
Thank you. Second question.
So I guess just adding to the idea of sustainability in funding education, how can we then expand, how can donors expand their engagement in how money is mobilized, allocated and distributed, including that fund or any other alternatives that could be coming in education financing. And I guess this is building towards, the consensus around perspectives of people included or missed in the development of education program is effective. So how do we start expanding that consultation?
Thank you. I can only take these two questions, otherwise you will lose your coffee break, but there will be opportunities during the coffee break to ask them. So the two questions, revolving fund, a little bit like IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and or how to expand actually this question to the entire funding of education and how education funding is allocated also to emergencies. Who wants to take these two questions in one? Oh,
Yeah.
I'd like to see the banker's perspective on
Maybe
this.
very quickly on the evolving fund. Yeah, our proposed solution has no end time basically. So we really target there a long-term mutual fund that has no target age or anything, and this would greatly help to us as well if this support continues after 2026. So that's completely also in our minds that this is a long-term fund and not only a project till 2026.
Thank you very much. Who else?
I mean, I would, on the fund, to be honest, I'm not sure. And I think we should be careful about setting up new things if they, to check that they're necessarily needed. But I defer to smarter people than me on the panel, including Roger, who just made a very good point on that. But I did want to pick up the point about expanding consultation, because 3 weeks ago, I was in Kayunga district, in a couple hours outside of Kampala in Uganda, with our team who've been doing some work at the district level. In fact, sort of below the district level, at the parish level in the Ugandan administrative system. So a few villages, and we're working very hard with the local government there to make sure that the data system that they need to build there, and they do need to build a data system there and build in digitization and so on, is properly embedded in the perspectives of those that the system is there to serve. And it's not really rocket science. You just talk to people and you listen, and then you work in a way that's ethical and respectful of people, which includes, of course, trying to make sure that the benefits of the data that you gather goes as quickly as possible back into the hands of the same people who help you generate it, right? As well as feeding up the system into national government, into the SDGs reporting and so on. But I think overall, if we're thinking big picture, if we're thinking joined up, and if we're thinking long term, then we're on the right track. Big picture, because actually the whole humanitarian system is underfunded. Only 56% in 2021 of needs were actually met, so it's not a problem particular to education in emergencies. So we've got to fight that big fight. Joined up because, as Rob and others have said, embedding thinking around education in humanitarian and development thinking has got to be the way we've got to think about these things. And long term, the average duration of a humanitarian emergency response now is 9 years. These things do not come and go in a few weeks or months. This is a sustained effort. We have to think long term in order to ensure that we're responding in the right way.
Thank you very much. I take this as a conclusion. Thanks a lot, Sarah, Adrian, Rob, and Roger, you've been outstanding panelists. Thanks to you all here in the room and you online for taking part in this conversation. My two takeaways from yesterday and today are also very simple, a sentence each. The first one is education beats poverty. And I think that's really something we have to keep in mind. And the second one is from an American comedy writer, and it goes like, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. So thanks very much for participating. Thanks for keeping the mobilization going. And thanks for reuniting these 826 million Swiss francs or dollars for education cannot wait. We have to get to 1.5 billion. So there is still some work to do. Thanks a lot. Have a good day.